In 2010, I was driving from New Orleans, Louisiana to Eugene, Oregon. It was just me, 24 and female, and my 2-year-old pit bull in a 14-foot U-Haul truck with everything I owned crammed into the back. I had my fancy flip phone and my printout of MapQuest directions. I think the first smartphones actually came out around this time, but I actually didn't have one yet. Cell phone service was also much spottier at the time, and there were long stretches through the desert where I had zero service for hundreds of miles. I was driving a lonely stretch of highway through central Texas when I realized I hadn't seen a town or exit for a very long time, and my giant U-Haul truck was really low on gas. Just when I'm starting to freak out though and seriously run low, I see a small town coming up ahead. I pull into this town and it is absolutely tiny. I was so worried about other things that I never did pay attention to the name of the town, but there must have been only 6 streets in the entire place. I go gas up and I get ready to head back onto the road. Except I cannot for the life of me find my way back to the highway now. I circle the town about 4 times and start getting frustrated. This is such a tiny town. How the hell can I not find my way out? I can literally see where the highway is, but somehow I just can't find the way to get to it. I return to the gas station to ask for directions. Now, when I first got gas, I paid at the pump and never actually went in. When I enter for directions, there's this skinny, nondescript guy who has black hair hanging down in front of his eyes. He really looked like he could use a good wash. He was not particularly creepy per se, but he was a little bit rude. He never really met my eyes. Instead, he was looking down at a magazine the entire time. He also gave me directions that really didn't sound right at all. He's telling me to take a road that will get me to the highway in about 17 miles. For a moment, I was dumbfounded. I pointed out quickly that I hadn't driven that far in the first place to get from the highway into town, so why would it be so far back to the highway? I could literally see where it was. I could literally see the location of the highway. He was so casual, almost like I was being an annoyance. He said I could follow his directions or not. Why should I care? He gave me some explanation about the road curving around that really didn't make much sense at all. He also still refused to look at me. Just, whatever, I gave you your directions and waved his hand in the direction of the door. When I got into the parking lot, my whole body started trembling violently, and my heart started racing suddenly, seemingly for no reason. I got into the truck, and as soon as I put the key into the ignition, I burst into tears. I had this terrible feeling that no matter how nonchalant he acted, this man had bad intentions with those directions. I didn't know what exactly they were, but I knew right then and there that there was no way I was going to follow those bogus directions. And yet, this was the only store in this little town. And short of knocking on every door, no thank you. There was no one else to ask for directions. I decided I really didn't give a shit if this town seemed like something that dropped straight out of the Twilight Zone. I was going to drive around until I found my way out, even if it took all damn night. At this moment, a big beater of a pickup truck, as much rust as metal, pulled in and disgorged the quintessential Texan man. Huge, husky, and in flannel work boots. Without even thinking about it, I jumped out of the truck and approached him quickly, yet warily. Looking into his eyes, though, I could see he was a kind human being, or at least I was hoping so. I asked him if he could please give me directions to the highway. I told him I knew it was silly, but I just couldn't seem to find my way back somehow. Thankfully, he looked very concerned as I was visibly upset, so he made me laugh and very cheerfully gave me directions for a hairpin curve turnoff right at the end of the small concrete tunnel I had passed by several times. He said it was common. It often confused travelers because it was so hard to see from the outside. He said they'd need to put up some signs sometime soon. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I asked him how far in miles it was back to the highway. He laughed and gave me this funny look. "Miles, miss? I'd say it's a quarter mile at most. I mean, you can see the highway right from here." At this point, I couldn't help it. I had to know. "Well, what happens if I drive here?" I gave him the directions the man in the store had just given me. Texas looked at me very intently and asked me how I even knew about that route. It was pretty far out, and usually only locals knew about it, so I told him. He was very quiet for a few minutes, then asked what the attendant had looked like and if I had a map of the state. No, just my MapQuest map, which wasn't very helpful in this situation. He goes to his truck and grabs a raggedy local map from his glove box. Spreading it out for me, he traces the route I described to him. The way the man from the gas station had told me to go led directly away from town, away from the interstate, and led seemingly right into the middle of nowhere. Texas told me that the road did go about 17 miles, right before it dead-ended in the middle of the desert. I asked him what was out there. He told me it was nothing but some junked cars and a few trailers and mobile homes, all owned by the same family. This family was known locally as troublemakers, meth heads, and alcoholics, and these were the nice things the townspeople had to say about them. The erstwhile clerk was a part of this family and lived down that road. I'll never forget the look in Texas's eyes as he told me this. He also told me I was very smart to listen to my instincts and told me to be careful traveling out there from now on. I don't know if the man from the gas station wanted what was in the back of my U-Haul or what was in the driver's seat, but thankfully I didn't have to find out. Oh, and I also learned that sometimes angels look like ruddy-haired Texans with scruffy faces and rusty pickups. Thank you, random Texan stranger. You really saved my ass, and I'll always remember you with tons of love. I'm sorry I didn't ask for your name at the time. You're forever Texas to me now. This was about 4 or 5-ish years ago. Back then, I lived with my mother in a shed on a farm surrounded by woodland. Our farmland was part of a larger piece of farmland that was split up and sold off, so we did have neighbors, though they were roughly half a kilometer away each. We loved that though because of the privacy. So it wasn't like there was nobody nearby I could go to if I needed help. That thought is what had me fearlessly walking alone at night between the hours of 7 and 8 p.m. sometimes, fluctuating from earlier to later depending on the day. Sometimes I even went out on a walk at 2 a.m. in the morning because I was restless and couldn't sleep. Looking back, this was probably incredibly stupid, and after this incident, I never walked after 6 p.m. ever again. Always making sure there was at least some sunlight left whenever I set out. The route I always took was a road circuit. The first part was out in the open in front of all the other farms, including my own. If anything had happened, at least one person would have noticed, and reception was pretty good as well, so I would have been able to call someone. The second half, on the other hand, was concealed by about 200 meters of woods between the farms and the back road. Stretching the full 2 kilometers at the back of the farm, it was during that part of the walk when I had this creepy encounter. It was late at night. I can't remember exactly what time, but I do know it was pitch black with the exception of my torchlight. I was about to approach the turn in the loop that would bring me out into the open again when I heard it. Help. It was this monotone voice that repeatedly asked for help. It didn't seem panicked in the least. I took my headphones out and turned my music off to make sure I was hearing correctly, but it didn't stop. Help. Help. A very stupid part of me almost responded, because for some reason my first instinct was, oh no, someone's in trouble, like a naive kid, although I would have been about 16 or 17 at the time. Of course, my rational brain kicked in and realized that approaching a random voice was just about the stupidest thing I could do. I started quietly backing away. Unfortunately, my cat had also followed me on this walk and was not backing away with me. No, she was walking toward the voice, softly hissing. I remember desperately trying to get her to come back towards me without alerting the voice to my presence, just in case they hadn't noticed me yet. I was getting scared and didn't want to stay there a moment more, so I ran forwards and grabbed her, then turned around and bolted back towards my house. I don't know if it was stupid of me to turn my back to the voice as I was making so much noise while running. There would have been no way they wouldn't have known I was there, and I would have had no way of knowing if they were giving chase. I was so terrified the entire time. The image of someone cloaked in shadows chasing me entered my mind, even though I couldn't hear anyone behind me. I never once slowed down until I was back safe and sound within my own home. The story doesn't end there, though. Despite how terrifying that experience was, there was still a part of me that was concerned about whoever it was that was asking for help, because what if they really needed it? So I asked my mother to drive us to the location, another very stupid decision considering what we found, that being a whole lot of nothing. We called out and called out to the person, but nobody ever answered. We didn't get out of the car though. Luckily, neither of us were that stupid. We drove home having seen nothing, and no one. It still bothered me in the morning though, so I had my mother drive us over again, and we searched the immediate area. Nothing. No indication anyone had ever been there. There was no body either, which was admittedly a drastic thing to search for. But I know shock can leave you eerily calm, which could have explained the monotone voice, and the lack of response afterwards made me fear we'd been too late, and we'd find a dead person in the morning. I don't know if I would have preferred that outcome, but then at least I would have had a face to put to the voice. But no, we found absolutely nothing, and to this day I have no idea who that voice belonged to, and why they were so monotonously calling out for help. My mind has naturally come to some chilling conclusions and theories that leave me unable to sleep. Perhaps a rapist, a kidnapper, a serial killer, all the classic horror stories. But I guess I'll never really know for sure. Before COVID-19 hit the United States, I was going to college in a city a few hours away from my hometown. I was living in an apartment in said city with a good friend from high school. There was this one weekend where she went home to visit her family, and I had to stay back due to the fact that I had to work that weekend. This was a Friday, and I had the day off, so after school I decided to relax and watch some true crime. I'm in the kitchen making dinner at around 6:30 or 7 when I hear this loud knock at my door. I immediately freeze, something I wouldn't normally do. I just had this really odd feeling that somehow I should not answer no matter what. I tried to stay quiet and I waited and tried to listen to what was happening outside from my kitchen. There was another really loud knock, followed by someone shouting, "Apartment check for my apartment number." This was when I knew something was off. It was almost 7 p.m., and the apartment's office, maintenance, and anything else involving the apartment complex closed by 4. I simply stayed quiet until I knew they were gone. After they moved from my apartment, though, I heard them do this to the next 2 apartments down the hall from me, once again stating, "Apartment check for apartment number." I went on with my night and didn't think too much about it after. However, I was definitely more alert for the rest of the night, especially due to the fact that I was there all alone. Later that evening, I had to go to the 7-Eleven across the street from my apartment. I drove because the area I lived in was extremely questionable, to put it nicely, especially for a female at night. As I'm driving back to my apartment, I see 4 or 5 cop cars right outside my building. I also notice a man is handcuffed and they're placing him in the back seat. I don't know if this was related, but I had a very strong feeling that it was. I'm not sure what exactly the purpose of this apartment check scam was. I thought maybe it was someone with intentions of robbing the place, who wanted to pose as a worker at the apartment to scope it out. I'll never know for sure what their intentions were, but I'm very glad I didn't decide to answer that door. I'll try not to make this too long, but I want to put this out there for kids and parents alike. Not even your employer can be trusted. This was the summer of 2004. I was 15 at the time and working weekends at a skate park, running the registers and keeping up shop. I was the only female employee there. The reason I got the job, I thought at the time, was because I used to hang out there a lot prior to being offered a position. They also used to host events and hardcore rock shows a ton. Those were extremely fun and the place where all my friends gathered for a good time, so we got to know the owners pretty well. The two guys that owned the shop were in their 40s, overweight and balding, typical older white guys, but they were extremely nice. Let's call them Doug and Mark. Now Doug was always more serious about the business, always trying to come up with new ideas to better it and rarely joking around. He was also married with kids. Mark, on the other hand, well, he seemed a lot like Doug's minion. He was always out running errands, making calls, or cleaning up the shop. He was a single guy. He was very outgoing and silly, so we always had a lot of fun with him around, until one day, when the fun stopped. Before I tell you about the scariest moment in my life, I'll inform you of the events, or I'd like to call them red flags leading up to it. On one occasion, we were hosting a show where a local metal band was playing. There were lots of people there, kids and adults alike. They were skating and running up and down the ramps and bowls, just generally having a really good time. Then Mark suddenly came up behind me as I was talking to my friend Katie. He picked me up and swung me over his shoulder and started tickling and spinning me around, right in the middle of the crowd. I laughed it off and was yelling for him to stop in a giggly voice, but I was honestly pretty creeped out. He had never touched me before, even in a friendly way. Even at 15 years old, I found this very inappropriate for a man in his 40s to be so touchy on me. After about a minute, he put me down and was laughing and apologizing. I didn't think so much of it anymore. I thought maybe I was just overreacting. A week or two went by, and I noticed Mark was starting to give me flirty looks and sticking his tongue out at me when he was around. Again, I didn't think too much of it. He had always been such a nice guy. I thought he was just trying to be funny. One day, Mark called me into the back. We had two doors behind the register that led to our stock room, as Doug sat on a register on a business call. When we got to the back room, he picked me up, set me on the washing machine, and told me he really wanted to kiss me. I automatically shut him down. He then tried to persuade me to lift up my shirt for him. At this point, I really freaked out. I was hoping Doug would come through those doors any second and help me. Again, I firmly told him no as I hopped down and proceeded to walk to the shop front again. That's when Doug opens the door. "Hey, what are you guys doing? Did Mark show you our butterfly collection?" I just responded with a confused, nah, and walked out. The two followed me. The rest of the day was pretty uneventful. I just really wanted it to end. I usually got off work around 6 or 7, but around 5, Doug asked me to go with Mark to run some errands. He jokingly said, "Take my credit card, but don't give it to Mark." All I could really think about was how awkward this ride was going to be. We hadn't talked at all since the incident earlier that day. I was really dreading this trip, but I had no idea what was about to unfold. So we get in the car and drive to my high school, which is on the other side of town, a medium-sized busy city, but about 5 minutes away from my house. As we pull in the back parking lot on a Saturday, I ask him just what we're doing here. He responds by saying, "I'm scouting out a new area for a skate park. It's behind the school here." This is when I started to get nervous. I was hoping it was true because I did know they were trying to expand locations at the time. He gets out of the car and motions for me to get out and come along. I hesitantly do so. We start walking to the back of the school. Now he's just talking about his visions of the park, nothing too serious. That's when we approach the woods. Not a wooded area, straight up dense forest-like woods that you could barely even walk through. That's when he says, "Take my hand, come on, I'll show you to the spot." This is when the alarms go off in my head, and I realized I could be in real danger if I went with him. In my head, I was contemplating running or just going along with him. I didn't know which one would make the situation worse at the time. I now know I should have run away. This pondering seemed like it went on forever, when in reality it was probably only a few seconds. Thank God I paused a second before making any decisions, because that's exactly when my cell phone rang. I honestly forgot I had it on me. It was my mom asking if she could come pick me up early so we could go to dinner together. That's when I told her with a sense of urgency. Yes, I'm at the high school. Come get me now. I think she could hear the fear in my voice and left immediately because she was there in less than 5 minutes. During those 5 minutes, I told Mark I had to go and wait on my mom. He seemed very agitated, but agreed and walked me to the front steps of the school to wait. He didn't even say bye or anything. He just walked briskly to his car and took off. My mom showed up a couple of minutes later. I hopped in quicker than I've ever done anything in my life. I know I must have been shaking real bad. I told her I was not in the mood to eat and to just drop me off at home. She asked me if I was okay. I said yes and that I and a coworker were just scouting for a new spot. I got dropped off at home and was in shock and fear. I quit working there that very day. I just never went back. I didn't explain anything to anyone, and I've only told my boyfriend and a couple of friends about this. I'm 100% convinced looking back on all of the red flags, and the fact that Doug didn't seem to trust Mark and was actually a good guy, that if I had went into those woods, I wouldn't be here today. Who knows what he would have done to me? Rape? Murder? Both? It's weird when you survive something like that. It never really seemed real to me, but it very much was. I myself have a 12-year-old daughter now, and I try to teach her about safety and predators all the time. That kind of thing can change you, and change the parent you become as well. As an update to this, that was about 2 years later, Mark called my house phone. No idea how he got my number even. He told me he was in Istanbul, Turkey, and about to open a skate shop there. I just told him to please not call me anymore and hung up. Luckily, the nightmare was over after that, but hearing from him suddenly was like talking to the devil again. I hope that man is dead or in jail so he couldn't hurt anyone else. I always wonder if Doug ever found out about Mark. Maybe Mark had to flee the country for a crime he committed or something, and that's why he was in Istanbul. This turned out to be longer than intended, but point is, as a woman or girl especially, never trust anyone who's been a creep to you. I don't trust much of anyone anymore. Full disclosure, this happened 10 years ago, but I still can't believe how lucky I was to get away. I was 16 and female, running late for school as usual. Walking down the road, I noticed a dark green car with tinted windows slowly following behind me. This was a residential community, and it was not unusual for people to drive by slowly. It was around 9 a.m. on a weekday, so I naively figured there was no danger as I hurried toward the bus stop. Arriving at the stop, it had just started to rain, so I decided to stand in the small glass bus shelter to wait for the bus. The creepy green car stopped right in front of the bus stop. The driver got out and approached me in the bus shelter. Now, this bus shelter was so small, there was only room for 2 people. He stood at the entrance and grabbed each side of the shelter, trapping me inside. He was very large and extremely physically intimidating. Something about his dead eyes sent chills through my entire body. He asked if I was familiar with the area. I responded that yes, I was. He asked if I was going to school. I responded again that yes, I was. He then asked if he could drive me to school so I could show him the way. Call it intuition, but something in my head was screaming not to get in the car with him. I politely declined his offer and asked if he needed help with directions or something else. He suddenly lunged at me, grabbing my arm. He pulled me out of the bus shelter towards his car. I started screaming as he kept insisting it would be faster to drive. Somehow though, by the grace of God, the bus pulled up at this exact moment. All my instincts told me to fight. I clawed at his face. I kicked him. I bit him. I contorted my body until he loosened his grip on my arm. Once free, I leapt on that bus as though my life depended on it, which it very well may have. The bus driver asked if I was okay right away, but I didn't even have time to reply. I ran to the back to find a seat and cried quietly in the corner as the bus carried me off to school. All day I sat in class and said nothing about what happened to me. When I got home from school, though, I told my parents what had happened. They were horrified, especially after I showed them the bruise from the man's hand on my arm. We called the police. The officer arrived late that evening and took my statement. He said there had been several similar incidents in the area. He asked if I could come down to the station and look at some pictures to identify the culprit. The following week, my mom and I head into the police station. The officer sets us up with a computer, and we start to scroll through the mugshots. There were so many. Not only was it discouraging to realize just how many known sex offenders there were close by, but after a while, all the faces just started to blur together. Losing hope of identifying the man, we were just about to give up when I recognized his dead eyes in one of the pictures. The officers asked me if I was sure. I confirmed it was him, but he had since grown a long beard since the photo was taken. They thanked me and said they would call if needed. 2 weeks later, the news announced the police had apprehended the man suspected of kidnapping and assaulting several young girls in the area. The news story included his mugshot. It was the same man I had identified. He was caught with one of his underage victims still in his car. It took years for the gravity of this incident to truly hit me. Had the bus arrived any later, had I not been able to twist myself out of his grasp, had he grabbed me while I was walking and didn't see him, so many ways this could have turned out differently. I was so fortunate, while others were not. When I was a teenager, I lived in a small town located about 30 miles south of Atlanta, Georgia. I did not get my license or my first car until I was almost 20 years old, so between the ages of 16 and 19, I hitchhiked very frequently. This was in the early 70s, when people still hitchhiked a lot, and many drivers were still willing to pick people up, in spite of the dangers and risks posed to both driver and rider. For the most part, I never had any trouble with the people who offered me rides. Occasionally, though, I would get picked up by someone who would really creep me out. This is a story about one such creepy ride I accepted, and about how 25 years later, I would discover to my great shock that I may have been much luckier at the time than I ever imagined. This incident occurred sometime in the summer of 1974, when I was around 17 years old. At that time, I was a 6-foot-tall, 175-pound, blonde-hair and blue-eyed guy who had no trouble connecting with girls for dates. In fact, my story begins with me standing on the side of the highway with my thumb out. I was trying to get back home after spending the weekend with my girlfriend, who lived in downtown Atlanta. I was traveling south, away from the city and out into the country where I lived with my parents. I recall I had only had my thumb out for about 15 minutes when this man in a big white Lincoln Town Car, a very large and expensive car at the time, pulled over beside me. As I walked up to this car, I scanned the inside and looked at the driver, trying to size up the situation as I always did, just to be safe. What I saw was a tidy car with a man in the driver's seat who looked to be in his late 30s or mid-40s, dressed in an expensive suit and tie. He had short black hair, wore black-rimmed eyeglasses, and appeared to be rather on the thin side, with a very gaunt face and dark eyes. I never did learn his name, but for the sake of this story, I'll call him Town Car Man. When I got up to the passenger side of the car, I leaned down toward the open window and told him where I was heading to. I asked him if he was going that way, to which he replied that he was in a soft voice and waved me in. I was not all that wary of him, as by all appearances he was just an ordinary middle-class businessman. I opened the door and got into the front seat next to him without any hesitation. Generally, when I accepted rides from strangers while hitchhiking, I like to try and engage them in chat, sort of as a way to pay them for the ride by providing good conversation, and maybe also put them at ease about picking me up by showing them I was harmless and not a creep. Even though I felt I didn't look that dangerous. Maybe only if you could call having long hair and dressing as a hippie fashion of the time dangerous. However, when I began trying to chat with Town Car Man in my normal fashion, with typical small talk, I instantly started getting bad vibes from him. I could tell that he was mostly ignoring everything I was saying, instead kept trying to steer the conversation towards asking me personal questions about myself, how old I was, where I went to school, if I had a girlfriend. I tried to answer his questions as politely as possible, without giving away much real information. Town Car Man just kept getting more and more personal though, asking me questions that hinted at whether or not I was sexually active with my girlfriend, telling me that when he was my age he went around horny about half the time, and had always been on the lookout for sexual adventures. As the ride progressed and we were going further and further out into the country, I began to get very uneasy. I started to sense something was not quite right about this man. We had now left the populated city behind, and were traveling down an old 2-lane highway through the countryside that was sparsely populated. There seemed to be hardly any other cars on the road. The more Town Car Man continued to ask me questions about myself, wanting to know very personal things about me. Like if I ever had sex with my girlfriend, all while glancing over at me from time to time with a sort of creepy knowing look in his eye, as if he was privately enjoying some dirty secret that only he knew about. The more uncomfortable I became. I don't know how to better describe it than that, and it really began to make me feel uneasy. His manner started to get very cagey, and I sensed there was some underlying motive to his questioning. It really put me on edge. I began to think about what I should do next. As in, should I ask him to pull over and just let me out, even though I was only about halfway to my destination and in the middle of nowhere? For the first time, I began to realize just how vulnerable I felt. What really started to make me feel uneasy, though, was when he started asking me if I wanted a drink of liqueur, indicating that he had several bottles with him in the trunk, and that if I wanted some, he'd pull over to the side of the road and mix me up a stiff drink. Because I was growing more and more uncomfortable, I declined his offer, saying I did not drink. It was a lie even at that age. I was already regularly drinking with friends. He would not take no for an answer though, and kept insisting I should really have just one drink. After all, he was such a great drink mixer, and it would only take a minute for him to fix a very special one for me. After I had declined his offer for something like the 4th time, he abruptly changed tactics once again. He began telling me a story about when he was about my age and a young guy in the army, how he used to hitchhike a lot too. He would sometimes get picked up by men who wanted to pay him money to have sex with them, and had anything like that ever happen to me? By this time, I had quite enough of all of this. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, that's never happened to me, and nobody had better offer that offer to me either." That knowing look instantly vanished from his face. I could tell he was totally irked how I had just reacted to his story. That exchange between us totally changed the dynamic inside the car, and he became very quiet. After a few minutes of uneasy silence, he spoke up and told me he was turning in at the next intersection, and I would need to get out from there. Even though he had told me when he first picked me up he was going my entire way. At this point I was very relieved though. I now only wanted to get out of this car. When the car came to a stop, I had just barely gotten out and pushed the door closed when he stomped on the gas and zoomed off, literally jerking the handle out of my hand. I remember that I stood there watching him drive away until he disappeared down the road, and my heart was beating very fast. I was both scared and angry at what had just happened. After I calmed down a bit, I resumed hitchhiking until I got another ride that took me home without further incident. Fast forward 25 years. It's 1999, and I had all but forgotten about my creepy ride with Town Car Man. I'm on the internet reading through a true crime website when I stumble onto a story about an ultra creepy guy named Robert Bennett. A man who had been arrested after a series of vicious attacks on men whom he had picked up in his car, drugged, handcuffed, and then set their genitals on fire with a flammable liquid. The attacks took place over a 20-plus year period, starting in 1968 in the Atlanta area and ending with his arrest in 1991. Prior to Bennett's arrest, this attacker became known as the Handcuff Man, and talk within the local gay community was that he was targeting men with whom he thought were gay prostitutes. When I saw the photo of Bennett that accompanied the article, my jaw literally dropped open. The memories of my ride that day in 1974 came flooding right back. I was certain I was looking at a picture of Town Car Man, and I was absolutely floored. I don't have any way to prove that the creepy guy who picked me up was in fact this Robert Bennett, but the physical resemblance between what I remember about Town Car Man and the photo of Bennett are absolutely uncanny. And the persistent offer to mix me a special drink, his questions about whether or not I ever had sex with men for money, those also seem to indicate that possibility. I should point out that even though this story took place in the early 70s in the deep south of Georgia, I was actually okay with gay people at the time, and even knew a few people who were gay as well. I didn't have a problem with homosexuality at all, and still don't. But being heterosexual, I had zero interest in having sex with other men, and even if I had been game for that sort of thing, I always found it highly distasteful when people assumed they could act in such an unwanted, cagey fashion regarding sexual matters with complete strangers. I always have, and always will find that to be extremely creepy.